Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Christine Coons, and I wanted to do a quick discussion on the word bias, and that it isn't just a bad word that is used for different topics like misogyny or racism, things like that, things that we usually have a negative connotation with. I wanted to go back and talk about a little bit of my history. Or I still kind of play the violin. And one of the things I remember at the time is we always tuned the instruments right before a performance or practice or rehearsal. And we always tuned to A, an orchestra. And I knew growing up that A was 440 hertz. And one of the things that I did not know, and something that I just learned relatively recently, is a little bit more about concert pitch. I went to my favorite Wikipedia page on concert pitch, and I learned that, yeah, concert pitch across the world is set as 440 with some slight variation. Some people will tune to 441, some will do 442. Regardless, that the standard really for the most part is 440. But that has changed over the eras. And we go back to right here and says that a tuning fork was invented in 1711, enabling the calibration of pitch. Handel had a pitch for A at 422 hertz, whereas if you look down at Beethoven, it was pitched at 455.4 hertz. That's quite a spread. But over time, we have settled on the concert pitch of A, 440. That is based off of a harmonic scale and a whole bunch of mathematics. I won't even go into it because I don't fully understand it, but I found that really cool. And that is just one of those things that when I listen to music, I'm listening to 440 hertz nowadays. Back then, they were hearing at a different pitch. And so they had a different perspective on what the music should have sounded like. So that's kind of why I wanted to go into this topic of bias. It isn't a bad word, it's a difference in perspective. So we go into the definition of bias in of itself. It's a systemic distortion of a reality due to a reason not recognized or accounted for. Now, one of the things that is important with this definition is we as humans are systems. We are a system of a collection of senses, of cells. We are a system. Now, our reality, our perceptions is based off of our senses, and those vary from people to people, person to person. Bias is everywhere, and exactly, it's a part of our humanity. It is inherent to our human functioning. It's not necessarily bad, it's what we do with it or how we manage it that leads to healthy or unhealthy perceptions. This diagram has been made up in different forms across the internet. I love the concept. I really do. Over on the left is what I know. And to be honest, what I know is relatively pretty small. I mean, there's some things that I absolutely know. Like if you ask me about antibiotics, there's a selection of antibiotics that I'm very familiar with that I use on a regular basis. I'm very familiar with the side effects and interactions and consequences or expected consequences of these antibiotics and what microorganisms they cover. However, what I know that I don't know is I don't do surgeries. I don't do orthopedic surgeries. I don't do general surgeries. I have done them in the past during residencies and rotations, but those things are not familiar to me anymore. And that's been years ago. So I know that I don't know much about orthopedic surgeries. And there's the things that I don't know that I don't know. I don't know about the research that's going into newer antibiotics. I know there's some out there, but there's other things that we simply don't comprehend or understand. I love the fact that we're taking the James Webb's telescope, the newer telescope that's in a specific spot in space, and we're capturing these incredible images of the universe in its early stages. But even then, there are things that we cannot see beyond what James Webb's telescope can actually see. There are things that are much more minute and microscopic that we simply don't see, subatomic particles that we are still learning about when we're searching, trying to identify them in themselves. Sometimes we have a hint that they're there. Sometimes we may be surprised and go, oh, wow, there is something new that we didn't realize was actually in existence. So, one of the things that happens is going back to this um, bias is inherent to our human functioning. For example, Our brains are designed to create a bias. We want to favor certain information, certain topics throughout the course of a day. We tune out the noises, smells, concepts, language, words, all these things just to make it so that our day is manageable. We can function without being overwhelmed with too much data. And that's really what our senses are trying to do is give us this input and output that we can control and manage. So, for example, we attune our hearing to voices or certain sounds. If all of a sudden I were to hear a baby crying, I would be more attuned in listening to that baby crying. If there's a conversation going on in a large group of people, all of a sudden, oh, I know somebody's trying to call my name. I need to pay attention to where that's potentially coming from. Another example of is a sense of smell. If we were to walk into a room and say, oh my gosh, that's a terrible smell, over time, that smell becomes diminished. Some people will notice this with people who own pets. The owners don't recognize that they have a pet smell in their house. While somebody who walks into the room, they say, "Oh my goodness, you must have a dog or you must have a cat," because of the smell that they are not accustomed to. We also use inherent mechanisms to read faster and automatically. We we want to be efficient with our time, and as a consequence of that, we take steps. We can bypass things. We simplify things as much as we can so that we can do that. So, as a consequence, we use our knowledge, our education, experience, and adaptations to make millions of judgments every single day, every single moment we are engaging. And this is exactly what I'm doing right now. Is my bias is looking at a screen, changing from screen to screen, looking at my picture on the screen, and then going back and forth to make sure that I am engaging with the audience as would be perceived. So, our certain perceptions can change priority throughout the day. If you were to give a work, you have a stack of paperwork, and all of a sudden your boss says, "This needs to be done," boom, right here, right now, your focus changes to that new assignment. I love this quote. Obi-Wan Kenobi. This just shows you how much of a nerd I really am. Your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them. This next one is a perfect example of that. This is a mind game, if you will. How many F's are there in the following sentence? As you read this sentence, you're going to see a number of F's. Some people will say there are three, some people will say five. There are actually seven, and I'll leave that up there for a second, but there are legitimately seven, and I can show you to them. So one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. So seven F's. If you weren't aware of the trick, you would have noticed that most people will not count the F's in the words of. So there are different types of biases. Um, and a lot of these have negative connotations or unhealthy connotations to them. There are ways where these can also be used as a positive or a healthy bias in of itself. So confirmation bias, we give greater weight to evidence that confirms our views and experiences. Attribution, making a judgment on a cause of an action. Best example of that is my youngest child blaming a object that or he tripped and he blames the object as the reason for why he tripped. Affinity, we prefer people who share similar qualities to ourselves. We tend to form groups of people that have similar tastes and interests. This is where we come up with our friends and some families or even develop romantic relationships. A lot of it has to do with affinity. So not necessarily always a unhealthy bias. It can also be a healthy bias as well. Beauty. We prefer information from sources we perceive as beautiful. Conformity, agreeing with the views of the majority to avoid standing out or confrontation. And then the contrast effect, making a judgment comparing groups of people instead of assessing a person on their individual merits. These are just some. There are lots of biases out there. And the one that I frequently have to be mindful of in the hospital is anchoring bias. If I were to admit a patient from the emergency room, often what happens is the provider, the doctor that's covering that patient right then and there, calls me up and says, I have a patient that needs to be admitted to the hospital. They talk to me about the case and they give me their best estimation of what the diagnosis is. Now, I can take that information and say, I agree with it, or I don't agree with it, or I simply don't have enough information. So while they're talking, I'm also gathering information and reviewing charts and reviewing things in my mind about what the potential could be for the diagnosis of this patient. Um, Several years ago, I had a patient that came into the hospital short of breath. They had moved from a different state and they had done imaging of the patient's lungs. And then one side of the lung had a huge amount of fluid inside of it. The ER doctor gave me the perception that this was probably going to end up being cancer. Turns out it actually wasn't cancer. Once I had talked to the patient a little bit more about their history and what was going on, it actually turned out to be a certain type of infection, a fungal infection from the Southwest. So if I had anchored onto that diagnosis, I may have missed a treatment or a treatment plan that would have helped the patient and also helped him to calm his nerves a little bit because nobody wants to hear the word cancer about a potential diagnosis. So being mindful of that can help an individual in the long run. These last few slides are really about how do we work with this? How do we control for biases? One, we have to acknowledge they exist. They are part of us as humans and we engage with them constantly. We need to learn to avoid unhealthy biases and promote positive. Healthy biases are typically promoted by taking time and engaging beyond our usual patterns. Humans are creatures of habit, and we tend to like to fall back on those habits very easily. So, healthy biases tend to be dynamic, they tend to be adaptable. Unhealthy biases, in contrast, are typically what we naturally fall on with those patterns and practices when we are tired or get lazy. We rely on our history of patterns and experience instead of actively engaging with work and data. And oftentimes these tend to be very stale. These are practiced and rehearsed. Now, not necessarily bad in of themselves, but for example, if you are practicing a music piece, you are engaging in a healthy practice of practice until your body can get accustomed to it. However, if you get to a performance and you are very tired and you just go on to rote memorization and what your body is used to doing, well, unfortunately, your performance may actually end up being a little stale or not as good as you would expect it. That energy and that drive isn't conveyed to the audience as you would typically expect with a quote unquote good performance. Sometimes the audience will say, well, they seemed a little off that day. Maybe they were just tired. Maybe the engagement just really wasn't working out for them. All sorts of things could have happened with that. I know this is a little confrontational or faith is a form of bias. In a way, yes, it is. And people will say, well, what's the difference between faith and this confirmation bias? Well, a lot of it has to do with how we use it. Um, Mosiah 3:19 in the Book of Mormon, and this is also looking at from an LDS perspective, talks about for the natural man is an enemy to God and has been from the fall of Adam, and will be forever and ever unless he yields to the enticings of the Holy Spirit, and putteth off the natural man and becometh a saint through the atonement of Christ the Lord, and becometh as a child, submissive, meek, humble, patient, full of love, willing to submit to all things which the Lord seeth fit to inflict upon him, even as a child doth submit to his father. When I was reading this verse, I really actually went back to these differences between healthy and unhealthy biases. Um, the natural man, to me, is engaging in unhealthy biases. And the encouragement of developing better, improving ourselves is that engaging in healthy biases. When I look at the Bible in the New Testament and the life of Jesus Christ, I see that he was all about overcoming bias. The woman taken in adultery, he who is without sin cast the first stone. He's engaging, he's adapting to what needs to be done for that situation. And then also, he spent time with others, lepers, Samaritans, publicans, and sinners. He was overcoming this affinity bias that is inherent to a lot of people. So the question really comes down to what we're using with our faith. Do we use our faith to confirm our biases or enhance ourselves and those around us? Do we use faith that is stale, that we fall back on practices that are lazy or we get tired? We're just doing this just because. As I close out, these are some of the things that I thought of that when I was thinking of a healthy bias and the things that I would concepts and thoughts that arise from healthy bias. I had these thoughts. One was, thank you for sharing your perspective. I gained additional insight. Maybe you gained some additional insight. This is just my perspective on bias. And I know there's lots of philosophies, there's lots of ways to look at this. This is just simply one way to engage with this and look at it and go, huh, that's interesting. I see you are working on a project. Can I help or watch? I would like to learn. Again, that engagement and adaptability. I am curious about your beliefs and how they differ from mine, learning a different person's perspective and their understanding. What resources can I utilize to learn about this topic? And my favorite one is just, I wonder. And I do that a lot is, I wonder about this. And considering this, where can I go to find that additional information? So from a religious perspective, when we look at scriptures, these are words that we see feasting, bread of life, knowledge, living water, ask and ye shall receive, and learning, as it would say in Proverbs 1, verse 5. So to conclude this out, bias is everywhere and a very part of our nature. And understanding and controlling for bias is the intent of research and learning. So, what I wanted to do with this whole entire discussion was to set a foundation of understanding bias and why we set up research and learning the way that we do. This is going to segue into talking about the scientific method and then also the research methods that we have in gathering information, researching it, and then also beyond that, taking all these research studies and collectively combining them into one. So again, my thoughts and perspectives. Thank you for your time. Have a good evening.